The mountains stood tall and silent, shrouded in a veil of mist and snow. The cold wind howled through the narrow passes, and the once sturdy path seemed to vanish under the blanket of white that had overtaken the world. It was the kind of blizzard that sent a chill deep into your bones, that made every gust of wind feel like a slap in the face, as though nature itself was warning anyone foolish enough to travel. But they didn't heed the warning. A small group of travelers, weary from their long journey, trudged through the snowstorm with a mixture of impatience and determination. There was James, the leader of the group, a tall man in his early 30s with a rugged look and a voice that could command attention. Beside him was Claire, a quiet woman in her mid-20s, whose wide, innocent eyes belied the pain she'd hidden for so long. Then there was Frank, a jovial man with a bushy beard who often cracked jokes to keep the mood light, despite the increasing intensity of the storm. Finally, there was Sarah, a young woman who had only recently joined their group, still a stranger to most, but eager for adventure and escape from her own troubled past. The group had been hiking for hours, the distant town they had hoped to reach now hidden behind walls of snow. With every step, the storm seemed to grow fiercer, as if the very mountains themselves were pushing them back. They had originally planned to stop at a cabin nestled deep in the woods, a place known for its warmth and shelter during harsh winters. But as the storm worsened, they realized the cabin was nowhere in sight. James stopped in his tracks, lifting his arm to signal for the group to halt. His breath came out in visible clouds, his face flushed from the cold. "We need to find shelter. There's no way we're making it through this storm if we keep going like this," he said, his voice strained from both the cold and frustration. Claire, who had been struggling to keep up with the others, nodded with relief. "I can't feel my fingers anymore. Do you think the cabin is close?" Frank, who had been scanning the horizon, shook his head. "No sign of it. It's like the snow's hiding everything. We might have to wait it out here." Sarah, shivering uncontrollably, looked around. The snowstorm had created a world of whiteness and confusion, the swirling gusts making it impossible to distinguish the trees or even the path they had been following. Everything seemed blanketed in an eerie, otherworldly quiet. "I'm scared," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible over the storm's howl. "What if we're lost forever?" Claire gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Don't worry. We'll find somewhere to wait out the storm. Can't last forever." James nodded. "Let's keep moving. We're not far from shelter. We just need to push through." But as they continued onward, the storm didn't seem to relent. In fact, it intensified with every step. The wind whipped past them with a force that made it hard to breathe, and snowflakes stung their faces like sharp needles. The farther they walked, the more the landscape began to change. The trees, once thick and towering, now stood bent and twisted, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands clawing at the sky. The air was thick with the smell of cold earth and dampness, but there was something else, something wrong. "Do you guys smell that?" Frank asked, his voice tinged with unease. James paused, sniffing the air. "I don't know. It's like something rotten." Claire's eyes darted nervously to the shadows beyond the trees. The wind had picked up even more, but now there was an undercurrent of something unnatural, as though the storm itself was alive. Suddenly, Sarah let out a sharp gasp, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you see that?" James turned, squinting into the storm. For a moment, the snow parted, and he thought he saw something moving just beyond the trees. A figure, tall and thin, shrouded in a tattered cloak. But before he could say anything, the snowstorm intensified again, the wind howling with such force that it nearly knocked them off their feet. "What was that?" Frank muttered, gripping his axe tightly. "I didn't see anything," James said, his voice sounding more uncertain than usual. But the feeling lingered. It was as though something was watching them. As they moved forward, the storm seemed to grow colder, more biting, until it felt like the very air was laced with malevolence. The world around them felt darker, and each footstep felt heavier than the last. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before they stumbled upon something unexpected. Through the swirling snow, they saw a faint silhouette in the distance. A structure. It was small, no more than a shack, but it stood as a beacon of hope in the desolate wilderness. Without exchanging a word, the group quickened their pace, their bodies desperately craving warmth and shelter. But as they reached the door, something caught Claire's attention. A mark, carved into the wood, seemed to glow faintly against the dark grain. It looked like a symbol, but it was unlike anything she had ever seen before. "James," she said, her voice trembling. "What is that?" James turned to look, but before he could respond, a bone-chilling gust of wind slammed the door open with a loud bang. The travelers stumbled inside, but the moment they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them with such force that it rattled the walls. The room was dimly lit by a single, flickering lantern that hung from the ceiling. The air inside was stale, musty, and colder than the outside storm. There was no fire, no warmth, just an eerie silence. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around the room. The walls were bare, save for old, peeling wallpaper and cracks that seemed to run deeper than the wood itself. In one corner of the room, an old chair sat empty, its legs warped by age. And then they heard it, the faintest sound like a whisper, coming from the far corner of the room. "What was that?" Frank whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for his axe. James motioned for them to stay quiet, his eyes scanning the room. There was nothing, just the creaking of old wood and the distant wail of the storm outside. But then it came again, a whisper, soft and insistent. "Leave, now." The voice, like the storm itself, seemed to swirl around them, filling the room with a sense of dread. Suddenly, the door slammed shut again, this time locking them inside. The temperature dropped even lower, and the shadows in the room began to stretch unnaturally long, as if something was moving just out of sight. The storm outside raged louder, the wind howling, the snow battering against the walls. But inside the shack, a deep silence fell over them, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breaths. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and then, without warning, the lights flickered once more, before going out entirely, plunging them into darkness. And that was when they felt it, a presence, cold and malevolent, wrapping itself around them like a suffocating shroud. "Get out!" the voice screamed, but it was too late. Something vengeful was already inside with them. The darkness pressed in around them, thick and suffocating. The lantern, now extinguished, left them in a pitch-black silence, with only the sound of their rapid breathing breaking through the void. Claire's heart thudded loudly in her chest as she fumbled for the matches in her bag. Her hands were shaking, and she could barely manage to hold them steady. "James, we need light," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her own heartbeat. James nodded, his face tight with fear. "I know, but we can't let our guard down. Whatever is in here with us. It's not natural." Frank, his axe gripped tightly in his hand, moved to the door, his eyes darting from one corner of the room to the other. "Is anyone else hearing that? Those whispers? They're not just in my head, right?" Sarah, who had been standing near the window, jumped at the mention of whispers. "I hear them too," she said, her voice shaking. They're getting closer." The wind outside had become deafening, the howling gusts rattling the walls, But inside the shack, it was eerily silent, save for the whispers. They weren't words they could understand, but they were unmistakably coming from somewhere nearby. The voices had an unnatural quality to them, as if they were both too close and too far at the same time. Claire finally managed to strike a match, her breath catching as the tiny flame flickered to life. She quickly held it to the lantern, which sputtered and hissed before igniting in a soft, golden glow. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push back the oppressive darkness, at least for a moment. James took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. Okay, we need to think. This storm isn't just snow and wind. This feels like something else, something alive. As he spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. Claire could see her breath in the air, and the chill settled deep into her bones. She tried to focus on the flickering lantern, but it seemed to waver as if the air itself was shifting. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and for the briefest moment, Claire thought she saw something in the corner of the room. Just a shadow, a figure standing there. But when she blinked, it was gone. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Not truly alone. Frank turned to James. What do we do now? If we're trapped in here, we need to figure out what's going on. And fast. James's gaze flickered to the window. The blizzard outside had intensified, the snow piling up against the glass, making it impossible to see beyond the storm's fury. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but the sinking feeling in his stomach told him that even if they managed to survive the night, they were trapped here. The storm wouldn't let them leave. We stay calm, James said, though his voice trembled slightly. We stay together, we stick to the plan. We wait it out until morning, then we'll figure out our next move. But even as he spoke, a sense of dread began to settle in his gut, gnawing at him relentlessly. There was something about the way the storm had trapped them, the unnatural way it had intensified when they entered this cabin, that felt wrong. Something beyond the blizzard was at work here, something malevolent. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the room, as if something had crashed against the wall. The sound was jarring, and it sent a shock of fear through them all. Frank immediately raised his axe, his eyes wide with alarm. What the hell was that? He shouted, his voice trembling. Sarah's face had gone ashen, and she backed away from the corner where she had been standing. It's coming from there, she said, her voice shaking. It's coming from the wall. The others turned to look, and for a moment, they all just stood there in stunned silence. There was nothing, just the steady pulse of the storm and the creak of the shack settling in the cold. But then, it came again, a soft, dragging sound, as if something was scraping against the walls, something heavy and slow. It was unmistakable now. The sound was coming from behind the walls themselves, moving through the very structure of the cabin. Claire's breath hitched, her eyes wide with terror. What is it? She whispered. What's behind there? Before anyone could answer, the whispers returned, louder, more urgent, swirling around them like a storm of their own. Leave now. James took a step forward, his jaw clenched. We need to find out what's happening. We can't just sit here. Are you insane? Frank shot back, his voice rising in panic. It's not safe out there, James. We don't know what's in here, and you want to go looking for trouble. But James was already moving. His eyes locked on the wall where the strange scraping noises had come from. His hand reached out, fingers brushing against the surface. It was cold, unnaturally so, colder than the rest of the cabin, as though something was beneath it, something alive. Without a word, James placed his hands against the wall and pushed. First, nothing happened. But then, with a sudden lurch, the wall gave way, creaking loudly as a section of it moved inward, revealing a hidden passage. The air behind the wall was thick, like the staleness of something that had been sealed away for years, untouched by the outside world. Frank stepped back, eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is that? What did you just do?" But it was Claire who spoke next, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think we're alone in here." They all turned to look. The whispers had stopped, replaced by something far worse. The air seemed to pulse with a heavy, oppressive presence. And then they saw it. In the doorway of the passage stood a figure, tall and shrouded in darkness. Its outline was vague, almost translucent, but they could feel its gaze on them, as though it was studying them, waiting. It was the spirit, the vengeful entity that had trapped them here, in the heart of the blizzard. The whispers had been its warning, and now it was here in the flesh, or whatever passed for flesh in the shadowy, frozen world. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice a low, cold hiss that seemed to reverberate through their bones. Claire screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm outside. The figure stepped forward, and with each step, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, the cold seeping deeper into their very souls. The cold gripped them harder now, seeping into their bones, numbing them from the inside out. Claire's breath was visible in the air, clouding in front of her face like a ghostly wisp. She could hear her heart pounding in her chest, the blood rushing in her ears as the figure in the doorway slowly, deliberately, began to move closer. James, unable to tear his gaze away from the figure, felt a chill unlike anything he had ever experienced in his life. It was as though the very air around him had thickened, turning cold and suffocating, making it impossible to breathe without effort. The whispers, though no longer audible, seemed to vibrate through the walls and floor, pressing in on them like a heavy weight. We need to leave," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Her wide eyes darted to the passage that James had opened, but no one moved. No one dared to look away from the shadowy figure standing in the doorway. The figure loomed, an unnatural, swirling mass of darkness, its edges blurring into the air around it, as if it didn't belong to this world. It stood still for a moment, watching them, almost as if it were waiting for something, waiting for them to react. James swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do you want from us?" he asked, the words choking in his throat. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, the motion unnervingly unnatural, like something that wasn't quite human. Then, it spoke, its voice like ice scraping across glass. "You should not have come here," it said, each word dripping with malice. "Now you are bound to the storm, just as I am bound to this place." Frank took a step back, his hand tightening around the axe, but the figure seemed to pay him no mind. Instead, its gaze was fixed solely on James, as though the others didn't exist at all. "What do you mean?" James demanded, his mind racing for answers. "What storm? What place?" "The storm is my prison," the figure answered, its voice chilling in the silence. "And you are my captives now." A shiver ran down Claire's spine as the words sank in. They had all come seeking shelter from the blizzard, but now it seemed the blizzard was no mere snowstorm. It was a manifestation of something far darker, something that had kept the figure trapped in this place for who knows how long. "I don't understand," Claire murmured, her voice barely audible. "Why us? What do you want from us?" The figure stepped forward again, its movement so fluid and unnatural that it almost seemed to glide across the floor. The temperature dropped even further, the frost creeping along the walls and floor, until Claire could see her breath coming out in quick, panicked puffs. She felt her body shiver involuntarily as the figure's presence seemed to weigh heavily upon her chest. "You are here because you are meant to be," the figure replied cryptically, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "You are the ones who will free me." And in doing so, you will seal your own fate." The words hung in the air, thick with a dark promise. Claire could feel the weight of them pressing against her, like a force pushing her down. What did it mean? How were they supposed to free the entity, and why would they want to? "Free you," Frank repeated, his voice hoarse. "From what? And why should we help you?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it moved toward the far wall, and with a strange, gliding motion, it reached out with a shadowy hand. The wall groaned under its touch, and before their eyes, the very structure of the cabin seemed to shift. The wood creaked as if the house itself were alive, and for a moment, Claire could have sworn the walls were pulsating, like a heart beating beneath the surface. "The storm will never end," the figure continued, its voice low and resonating in the cramped space. "It is the storm of my anguish, the storm of my wrath, and it will consume you as it has consumed others before you." Claire's stomach twisted in horror. "Others? How many?" The figure's form rippled with an eerie laugh, its voice echoing in the cabin. "Too many to count." A cold, breathless silence fell over the group as they processed the horrifying truth. This storm, this blizzard, was no natural phenomenon. It was the wrath of an ancient spirit, trapped in a twisted, eternal loop, and they were now caught in its web, bound by forces they couldn't even begin to understand. "Why us?" Claire asked again, her voice trembling. "What do we have to do with this?" The figure finally turned its gaze to her, its eyes glowing brighter now, a sickly yellow that seemed to burn into her soul. It was as if it were peering into her very thoughts, her deepest fears. "You came seeking refuge," it said, "but now you will serve a greater purpose. Whether you live or die does not matter. You are here to fulfill your role." "What role?" James demanded, his voice rising in desperation. "What role?" The figure's lips curled into an almost imperceptible smile, one that sent a shiver of dread through them all. "To be the key," it whispered, "to open the door, and to close it before anyone could respond." The temperature dropped to an unbearable level, and the wind outside howled with renewed fury. The walls seemed to shake, the wood groaning under the strain. Something was changing, something that they couldn't see but could feel in their bones. Frank's eyes darted to the window, but it was as though the blizzard outside had come alive, swirling in an angry frenzy. The snow was no longer just falling. It was moving, shifting, as though it were part of some larger, darker force. "It's coming," Frank said, his voice tight with fear. "We have to get out of here. Now." But as he turned to the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The force of it rattled the entire cabin, shaking the walls as if the house itself were alive and angry. The group froze, staring at the door, the terror of being trapped sinking in deeper. The figure in the doorway chuckled softly. "There is no escape. The storm is upon you, and now you will see what it truly means to be trapped here." The cold, oppressive presence in the cabin grew stronger. Claire could feel it in her lungs, in her throat, a constricting pressure that made it hard to breathe. It was as if the very air had turned to ice, freezing her from the inside out. Then, with an unearthly screech, the door splintered, and the figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing brighter now, the shadowy form expanding like a dark, consuming fog. The walls seemed to shrink inward, and the room itself felt like it was closing in on them, the very cabin turning against them. Claire's heart raced as she backed away from the figure. "What do you want from us?" The figure's voice echoed in the freezing room, louder now, as though the storm had begun to take shape within it. "I want you to understand that there is no way out of this." Suddenly, the floor beneath them groaned and cracked, and a terrible scream echoed from deep within the cabin. one that seemed to belong to no living creature. Then, everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears as she stumbled through the pitch-black cabin, her hands desperately searching for anything to hold on to. The temperature had plummeted to an unimaginable low, the air so thick with frost that it was difficult to breathe. She felt as though she were drowning in ice. The others were as disoriented as she was. The last thing Claire remembered was the horrifying scream that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the cabin. And then, just like that, everything had gone silent. "Claire?" James's voice broke through the darkness, shaky and frantic. "I'm here," she called out, relieved to hear his voice. "Where's Frank?" "Sarah?" "I don't know," James replied, his voice trembling. "But we can't stay here. This place it's not safe. We have to find a way out." They both fumbled through the dark, their movements slow and uncertain. Every sound they made seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. Claire's breath caught as she felt the sharp sting of something cold and wet against her skin. She touched her face, realizing with horror that the snow had begun to seep in through the walls. The storm was no longer just outside. They were trapped in the heart of it. "I can't see anything," Claire whispered. "Where are the others? Frank? Sarah?" James didn't answer at first, but Claire could feel his anxiety mounting. She could hear his breath hitching in his throat. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. And then, "There's something else here," James finally said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what it is, but I can feel it." Claire's blood ran cold. She could feel it too. The air had changed. It was heavier now, as though something invisible was pressing down on them. It wasn't just the cold. There was something more, something malevolent. "James, we need to find the others," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to get out of here before it's too late." But as she took a step forward, something shifted in the air. A low, guttural growl echoed from somewhere in the cabin, distant but unmistakable. It sent a chill down her spine, and she froze. "What was that?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," James replied, sounding even more fearful than before. "But I think it's getting closer." The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she strained to listen, her heart hammering in her chest. It was closer. "James, I don't think we're alone," Claire said, her voice shaking with fear. "I know," he replied, his voice tight. "We need to stick together. Don't let go of me." Just as they huddled together, a deafening bang came from the far side of the cabin, followed by a scream. It was Sarah's voice, sharp, terrified. "Sarah!" Claire screamed, trying to rush toward the sound, but her legs felt like lead. "No, don't!" James grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "It's a trap. It's not safe." But Claire couldn't ignore the desperate cry. "We have to help her, James. We can't leave her behind." Before he could argue, another blood-curdling scream echoed through the cabin, louder than before, and this time it was Frank. The sound was raw, filled with pain and terror. Claire's heart raced as she fought against James's grip, desperate to find her friends, to make sure they were okay. But the growl came again, much closer this time, and this time it wasn't just one growl, it was several all around them. A low chorus of snarling, rasping voices that seemed to come from every direction. "James, we need to get out. Now!" Claire shouted, panic rising in her throat. But there was no way out. The door that had been their only exit had slammed shut behind them, the sound of the storm outside muffled by the walls that now seemed to close in around them. The windows were frozen solid, and Claire could see nothing beyond the ice that covered the glass like a thick, impenetrable veil. They were trapped. Suddenly, the growling stopped, and a silence fell over the cabin once more. The kind of silence that made Claire's skin crawl. It was too quiet, too still. And then, the voice came again. Not from the figure they had seen earlier, but from somewhere else. The air around them seemed to vibrate with the force of it. A low, menacing whisper that seemed to speak directly to their souls. "You can't escape," it said, its voice so soft it was barely audible. "You belong to me now." Claire's heart stopped. The air felt thicker now, as if the storm itself had found its way inside. The wind howled, but there was no warmth left, no refuge. "We have to fight back," James said, his voice shaking, his words filled with desperation. "I don't know how," Claire whispered, feeling completely helpless. "We can't fight this. We don't even know what it is." "We don't have a choice," James replied, his tone fierce. "If we don't do something, we'll never get out of here. It's not just the storm we're fighting. It's something worse. Something ancient." The floor beneath them creaked, and a loud crash from the other side of the room made them both jump. Claire's heart raced as she spun around, searching for any sign of their friends. But the shadows seemed to shift and move, obscuring everything. A flash of movement caught her eye. A figure standing just out of reach, its features obscured by the darkness. "Frank? Sarah?" Claire called, her voice hoarse with fear. But there was no response, only silence. And then, a hand reached out from the darkness. A pale, clawed hand that seemed to float above the ground. It moved toward them slowly, deliberately, its fingers twitching as if beckoning them closer. James stepped forward, raising the axe as though it could ward off whatever was coming. But the hand didn't stop. It kept moving closer, its fingers curling as it reached toward Claire. In that moment, Claire realized with a sickening sense of dread that whatever they were facing, it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to stop until they were all gone. The hand stopped just inches from her face, and in that moment, Claire could see them, the eyes. They were not eyes as she knew them. They were black, empty voids that seemed to consume everything around them. The moment she met them, the world around her seemed to collapse into darkness. And then, nothing. The stillness in the cabin was suffocating. Every breath Claire took seemed too loud, every movement too deliberate, as though the very air around her was waiting for something or someone to make a wrong move. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. No, not just watched, but hunted. The air had grown colder, if that was even possible. The storm outside raged with an intensity that matched the cold inside. But it wasn't the weather that made Claire's skin crawl. It was the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to fill the room. James stood by the window, his back stiff, eyes wide, as if he were waiting for something to appear in the swirling snow outside. Claire could feel the tension in the air, an invisible force that seemed to press against her chest, making it harder to breathe. "Where are they?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. James didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse of snow. Then he turned to face her, his expression pale and drawn. "I don't know," he said, his voice tight, "but we're not alone here. Whatever this is, it's not just the storm." The words hung in the air like a warning. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She had felt it. The same unease, the same suffocating fear. But what could it be? It wasn't just the storm. No, there was something else here, something ancient, something angry. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sound, soft at first, like the faintest whisper on the wind. Claire strained to hear, but the words were indistinguishable, just a low murmur that seemed to swirl around her, slipping in and out of her consciousness. It was coming from somewhere inside the cabin, somewhere deep within the walls. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice shaky. James didn't answer right away. His eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing, just the wind howling outside, the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards, and the feeling that something was waiting for the right moment to strike. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Turn back. Leave. You don't belong here." It was a voice, soft and eerie, barely above a whisper. The hairs on Claire's neck stood on end as the words seemed to echo in her mind. The voice was familiar, hauntingly so, but she couldn't place it. It wasn't anyone she recognized. It wasn't Frank. It wasn't Sarah. It was something else, something that shouldn't be. "Who's there?" Claire called out, her voice trembling, but the only answer was silence. James moved toward the door, his face a mask of determination. "We need to find a way out. Whatever this is, it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." Claire nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She knew he was right. The storm outside wasn't the cause of the terror they were feeling. It was something inside this cabin, something that had been waiting for them, something that had been waiting for years. She followed James toward the door, but as her hand touched the cold handle, something stopped her. Cold breath. Not the wind from outside, but something inside. It brushed against the back of her neck, sending a shiver through her body. She spun around, her heart racing, but the room was empty. And then the whisper came again. "You can't leave. You are mine." The voice was louder this time, more insistent. It was as if it were in her very mind, inside her head, echoing with a sinister clarity that made her want to scream. James stepped back, his face drained of color. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Claire didn't know, but one thing was certain. They weren't alone. Whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't anything she could explain. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Leave now, or suffer." James grabbed Claire's arm, his grip tight as he pulled her toward the back of the cabin. "We have to get out of here. We have to find the others." But as they moved toward the back door, the temperature in the cabin dropped even further. The cold wasn't just in the air, it was inside them, chilling their very bones. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the room, followed by a horrific scraping sound. It came from the far corner of the cabin, where the shadows seemed to pulse and shift. "What was that?" Claire gasped, her breath coming in short gasps. "I don't know," James replied, his voice tight, "but I don't want to find out." They froze, the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end as the scraping sound grew louder, closer. It was like something was dragging itself across the floor, inching its way toward them, its presence heavy in the air. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The figure was tall, its body bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and stretched thin over its bones, its face twisted into a grotesque mask of hunger. But it was the eyes that held Claire's gaze. Eyes that were black as coal, empty, hollow, and filled with malice. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward them, its head cocked to one side as if studying them, its twisted smile spreading wider with each passing second. "No, no, no, no," Claire whispered, backing away, her legs trembling beneath her. James grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. "We need to get out. Now." But as they reached the door, it slammed shut in front of them with a deafening crack. The force of the impact sent Claire stumbling back, her heart racing. The figure didn't stop. It moved toward them, its every step sending a chill through the air. Its twisted smile widened as it reached out with long, gnarled fingers. "You cannot leave," it hissed, its voice a rasping, guttural sound. "You are mine." Claire could feel the coldness of its presence washing over her, suffocating her, and for the first time, she realized just how deep the terror ran. This wasn't just a storm. This wasn't just a haunting. This was something much older, something ancient, something that would not let them leave. The figure reached for Claire, its fingers brushing against her arm, and in that instant, everything went black. The cold was the first thing Claire felt when she woke. It seeped into her bones, numbing her senses, making her feel as though she were frozen in place. But there was something else too, a weight, a presence in the room. Her eyes fluttered open, but the room was pitch dark. The only sound was the soft crackling of wood in the corner, the low, steady hiss of the fire that had somehow survived the storm. But there was no warmth to it. The air felt stagnant, oppressive, as though the storm outside had found its way in through every crack and crevice. She moved her fingers, testing the limits of her body. The familiar cold bite against her skin made her shiver, and she realized she was lying on the floor, her head resting against the cold, hard wood. She didn't know how long she had been unconscious, but she knew something was terribly wrong. James? Her voice was a rasp, barely more than a whisper. She could feel the fear coiling deep within her, tightening her chest as she pushed herself up on shaky hands. There was no answer. Her heart hammered in her chest. Where was he? What had happened to them? She tried to push herself up, but her legs felt like jelly. She stumbled to her feet, the room spinning around her as she tried to gather her bearings. The darkness seemed to press in on her, suffocating her with its heaviness. She fumbled for the nearest source of light, a lamp on the table, but as her fingers brushed the surface, a terrible thought flashed through her mind. What if the storm hadn't stopped? She quickly reached for the door, her breath shallow and rapid. But as her hand touched the cold knob, she hesitated. The whisper, it was still there, lurking in the back of her mind. The voice that had followed them, pursued them from the storm. The voice that had promised they could never leave. It felt like 1,000 eyes were watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Claire's heart raced as she opened the door, stepping into the hallway. The cold rushed over her like a tidal wave, but it wasn't the snow. It was something else, something colder, deeper, more malevolent. She took a step forward, her breath forming clouds in front of her. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the flickering light from the room behind her casting shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. "James?" she called again, her voice trembling with fear. But there was no answer, only the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She took another step, and then another, each one feeling like an eternity. The storm outside raged louder now, the wind howling with a fury that shook the walls. The sound seemed to echo through the hall, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. As she walked, her thoughts began to spiral. Was she imagining it? Was she losing her mind? But no. She couldn't shake the feeling that the hall was growing longer, that the end was always just out of reach. No matter how far she walked, she couldn't see the end. The hallway twisted, curving in on itself. But when she turned the corner, it only stretched farther, an unending maze of wood and shadow. She stopped in her tracks. Something was wrong. The air felt heavier here, and the shadows in the corners of the hallway seemed to move, creeping closer to her, watching her every step. She could feel them pressing in on her, feel the weight of their presence pushing against her chest. And then she saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, the pale, distorted shape of something or someone just out of reach. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Claire could feel its gaze burning into her soul, pulling her forward against her will. A cold wave of terror washed over her, paralyzing her for a moment. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The figure was standing there, watching her, waiting for her to come closer. Her legs felt heavy, but she couldn't resist. She took one step, then another, each one pulling her closer to the thing at the end of the hallway. But it wasn't the figure that terrified her most. It was the voice that whispered in her ear, low and insistent, "Come closer. You cannot escape." She stumbled, the weight of the words crashing into her. She reached out, desperate to touch the walls for support, but her hands grazed the smooth wood as if it were an illusion. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls bending and warping, distorting as she moved. Claire's breath came faster now, her panic rising with each step. She had to get back to the cabin. She had to find James. They had to leave, but she couldn't stop walking, couldn't stop moving forward. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind with their venomous words. "You will never leave. You are mine. Forever." She turned around, but the hallway behind her was gone. The door she had come through had vanished, replaced by an endless stretch of darkness that seemed to grow deeper, more suffocating with each passing second. Her heart pounded in her chest as the floor beneath her feet began to shift. The room, the cabin, the world outside, it all felt like a distant memory now. She was lost, trapped in the maze of the storm, unable to escape. And then, just as she was about to break down, a hand gripped her wrist, pulling her back with a force that nearly snapped her arm. "Claire!" She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. It was James, alive, but pale and frantic, his face contorted with terror. "Get away from it," he shouted, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand. This place, it's cursed." Claire's mouth went dry as she looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "James, what is happening? What's going on?" James shook his head violently, his eyes wild. I don't know, but we have to get out of here. It's not safe." The whispers filled the air again, louder this time, as if the very walls were screaming at them. "You cannot leave," the voice hissed, the cold feeling tightening around Claire's chest. James's grip on her tightened. "We need to go now." But as they turned to run, the hallway seemed to close in on them, the walls narrowing with each passing second, trapping them inside a nightmare they could not escape. The storm raged around them, its icy winds howling like wild beasts trapped in a cage. James and Claire ran, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before them, an impossible maze of wood and shadows. Every step they took felt like it was pulling them deeper into the heart of the nightmare. "James, where are we going?" Claire screamed, her voice cracking from the cold and fear. James didn't answer. His eyes were wild, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her forward, but no matter how fast they ran, the hallway seemed to stretch farther, the end always just out of reach. Suddenly, Claire stopped, her heart pounding as a terrible thought pierced her mind. "It's not real, is it?" she whispered, more to herself than to James. "None of this is real." James froze, his grip tightening on her arm. He turned to face her, his face pale and haunted. "What do you mean?" "This place. It's like a prison," Claire said, her voice trembling. "The storm, the hallway, the shadows, they're all part of it, aren't they? The spirit, the one that's been chasing us, is controlling everything." James's face paled even further, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find the right words, but none came. The realization hit both of them like a crushing wave. The storm, the endless hallway, the whispers, it was all connected. They were trapped in a nightmare conjured by a vengeful spirit that had no intention of letting them go. But Claire didn't have time to think about it. The whispering grew louder, the voice growing more insistent, as if it was trying to tear apart her thoughts. "Turn back. You belong to me now." She shuddered, the cold sweat running down her back. The walls of the hallway seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. James's grip on her wrist tightened. "We can't stay here, Claire. We have to fight back. We have to find a way out." Claire nodded, but her thoughts were scattered. She didn't know how to fight a ghost, how to escape from a storm that wasn't real. But they had no choice. They had to try. She turned, looking for any sign of escape, but the hallway stretched on forever. There was no end, no exit, only the darkness. The spirit was toying with them, dragging them deeper into the storm's grasp, and they were running out of time. Suddenly, the air around them shifted. The temperature dropped even further, the cold becoming unbearable. Claire's teeth chattered as she looked around, but this time, the darkness wasn't just in the corners of the hallway. It was all around them, closing in like a suffocating fog. And then they saw it. At the far end of the hallway, the figure appeared again, the same twisted, distorted figure that had haunted them from the start. Its eyes glowed a sickly green, its body unnaturally contorted, its mouth opening wide in a grin that was more monstrous than human. Claire gasped, stepping back. It's here." James stepped in front of her, his face set in a grim expression. "We have to face it. There's no running anymore." The figure slowly began to move toward them, its steps silent, its body gliding unnaturally along the floor. With each step, the shadows around it seemed to grow deeper, darker, until it felt as if the entire hallway was swallowing them whole. Claire felt the terror creep up her spine, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. The whispers grew louder, more chaotic, until it felt like the very walls were screaming at her. But then something shifted. The storm outside roared even louder, shaking the foundation of the house. The wind howled like a beast in pain, the sound so deafening that it drowned out everything else. Claire's heart raced as the temperature plummeted further, the cold biting into her skin like ice. "We need to stop it," Claire said, her voice shaking but determined. "We have to break the curse." James turned to her, his eyes wide with fear. How? How do we stop something like this?" Claire looked at the figure, her mind racing. The storm, the hallway, the figure, it was all tied to one thing: revenge. A spirit trapped in an endless cycle of pain and fury. The only way to break the curse was to confront it, to face it head on. "I don't know," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but we have to try. We can't let it win." The figure reached out, its twisted hands stretching toward them like a dark, gnarled branch. It was almost upon them, its presence suffocating, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. "Please," Claire whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let us go." But the figure didn't stop. It reached for them with a speed that was too fast to comprehend, and Claire felt her heart stop in her chest as its fingers brushed her skin. The world seemed to go cold, colder than anything she had ever felt before. A wave of darkness swept over her, and for a moment, she felt as though she were falling into a deep abyss, pulled down by an invisible force. But then, something strange happened. A bright light suddenly filled the hallway, a blinding, searing light that pushed back the shadows and the cold. The figure recoiled, its form beginning to dissolve like smoke in the wind. "No," it hissed, its voice full of rage. "You cannot escape." But it was too late. The light grew stronger, pushing back the darkness, pushing back the storm. And with a final guttural scream, the figure vanished into the ether, its presence dissipating like a bad dream. The storm outside began to fade, the winds dying down, the cold slowly dissipating. Claire and James stood there, frozen in place, their hearts still pounding in their chests. They didn't know how it had happened, how they had broken the curse, but they knew one thing for sure. They had won. But as they turned to leave the hallway, a final whisper echoed in the air, soft, almost imperceptible. "You may have won this time, but I will return." And with that, the storm outside faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence. The world outside was quiet now. The violent winds had subsided, the snowstorm dissipating like a bad memory, leaving only a soft, eerie stillness behind. Claire and James stood in the hallway, their breaths slow and shallow, as if the air itself had become thicker, heavier. They looked at each other in disbelief, their minds still reeling from the ordeal they had just endured. "Is it really over?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. James didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the empty hallway, the shadows in the corners still seeming to move and shift despite the light. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. He could still feel the coldness in the air, a lingering chill that seemed to seep into his bones. The storm had ended, but something about the place still didn't feel right. "I don't know," he muttered. "It feels like it's just waiting." The shadows along the walls seemed to pulse with life, as if the house was alive, watching them. The sense of unease gnawed at them both, a feeling that refused to be shaken. They had escaped the worst of it. The spirit had been banished, the curse broken. But deep down, Claire couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they had not seen the last of this nightmare. James took a step forward, his voice low and uncertain. "Let's get out of here. The storm's gone, and we should leave before it comes back." But as he reached for Claire's hand, the temperature dropped again, more suddenly this time. Claire gasped as the air turned frigid, the icy breath of the storm returning in full force. "No," Claire said, her voice sharp. "It's not over. The storm is coming back." James froze, his heart skipping a beat. The cold had settled over them like a blanket, the atmosphere thick with something malevolent, something that was far from finished. He turned to look out the window, but all he could see was an endless expanse of white snow as far as the eye could see. The calm before the storm, and then they heard it, a low rumble, distant at first, but growing louder by the second. The howl of the wind, the familiar sound of the blizzard, returning with a vengeance. It was a sound unlike any other, a chilling roar that sent a cold shiver down their spines. The storm was back, and this time it was stronger, angrier. "What is happening?" James gasped, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. Claire grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "It's not just the storm. The spirit is coming back. We didn't banish it, we only angered it." The walls seemed to groan under the pressure of the storm's return, the house creaking and cracking as though it were being torn apart. The hallway stretched longer, darker, its shadows deepening once more, wrapping around them like chains. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as if the very space they stood in was collapsing. "No," Claire said, shaking her head in disbelief. "It's not supposed to be like this. We broke the curse." But her words were drowned out by the thunderous howl of the storm, now roaring through the house with terrifying force. The windows rattled, the floorboards shaking beneath their feet. The house seemed to breathe, its very walls alive with malevolent energy. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the hallway slammed open with a deafening bang. The darkness beyond it seemed to pulse, an endless void pulling them toward it. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall, shadowed, and grotesque, its form stretching unnaturally. The spirit. But this time it was different. It wasn't just the spirit of the house, of the storm. It was something more. It was the storm itself. It was as if the house had become the vessel for the spirit's rage, its vengeful fury manifesting in the very elements that had tormented them. The wind howled as the figure moved forward, its twisted, darkened face glowing with an eerie, greenish light. "You thought you could escape," the spirit hissed, its voice like ice scraping across metal. "You cannot leave this place. You belong to me now." Claire's heart pounded in her chest, terror seizing her every muscle. The storm outside was now inside, howling through the house with a fury that felt personal, directed straight at them. The walls seemed to close in, and the temperature plummeted even further, the cold unbearable, as if they were standing at the edge of the world itself. "We have to fight back," James said, his voice tight with fear and determination. "We can't let it win." Claire nodded, but her thoughts were a blur. She had no idea how they could possibly fight back against something like this. The storm had returned, more powerful than ever, and the spirit that had haunted them was now fully manifest, its power entwined with the very elements. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, faster than they could react, and Claire screamed as the spirit's icy hands reached for her. The air around her grew colder, the chill seeping into her very bones. She felt as if she were being dragged into the heart of the storm itself, pulled into a never-ending abyss. But James reacted instantly. He grabbed her, pulling her back just as the spirit's hand brushed against her skin. The force of it nearly knocked them both off their feet, but James held on, dragging Claire toward the door. "Run!" he shouted, his voice raw with panic. "We have to get out of here." But as they turned to flee, the walls of the hallway shifted again, closing them in. The house seemed to twist, the very space around them warping and bending. The storm was everywhere, filling every inch of the house, every corner, every shadow. There was no escape. Suddenly, a voice echoed in their minds, low and guttural, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You cannot escape. You will never leave." And then, with one final scream, the world around them collapsed. Darkness enveloped them. It felt as though the very air had thickened, pressing down on them like a suffocating weight. Claire and James were no longer in the hallway. The once familiar walls had vanished, replaced by a vast, endless expanse of swirling snow and howling winds. The world around them was distorted, warping and shifting with every breath they took. "No!" Claire gasped, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of the storm. "This isn't real. It can't be." James stood frozen, his eyes darting in all directions. The house had vanished completely. There was no door, no walls, just an unending blizzard stretching to infinity. The snowflakes were sharp, stinging their skin like thousands of tiny needles. The wind screamed through the void, its force so powerful it nearly knocked them off their feet. "Where are we?" James murmured, his voice filled with disbelief. This isn't the house anymore. We've been transported." Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and a loud, guttural noise rumbled through the air. It was the spirit, the vengeful entity had followed them here, dragging them into its own twisted domain. The winds picked up, roaring with a ferocity that made it impossible to hear anything else. The world around them seemed to be spinning, the snowflakes swirling faster and faster. A dark figure appeared before them, materializing from the swirling snowstorm like a living shadow. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, its face a twisted mask of anger and malice. The spirit had taken its final form. "You thought you could escape," it hissed, its voice like a blade scraping across stone. "You are mine now. The storm is my wrath, and you will never leave." Claire stepped backward, her heart pounding in her chest. James grabbed her arm, pulling her close, his grip tight with fear. "We have to fight back. There has to be a way." The spirit raised its hand, and the wind grew even stronger, the storm intensifying until the very snow seemed to freeze in midair, suspended like a frozen curse. The air was icy, biting into their skin, suffocating them. Claire could barely keep her footing, the blizzard threatening to tear them apart. But then something happened. Amidst the chaos and the storm's unrelenting fury, Claire felt a warmth in her chest. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily, spreading through her body. It was the strength they had gained from surviving the storm, the defiance that had kept them going, and something more, the realization that they had endured so much, faced death and despair, but had yet to give up. The spirit noticed the change in them. Its shadowy form wavered slightly, and a flicker of confusion passed over its twisted face. It had underestimated them. They were not like the others it had tormented. "Fight it," Claire whispered to James, her voice steadier now. "We can beat it. Together." James nodded, his face hardening with determination. They had faced unimaginable horrors, but they were still here, still fighting. They would not let this spirit claim them. The warmth in Claire's chest grew, a beacon of light in the heart of the storm. "We are not your prisoners," she shouted, her voice rising above the wind. "We won't be your victims." The spirit hissed in fury, but as it moved to strike, something changed. The storm seemed to hesitate, the winds faltering for the briefest moment. The snow stopped swirling, and the air grew still. It was as if the very storm had heard their defiance and had drawn back, if only for a moment. This was their chance. Claire and James reached out to each other, their hands finding one another's in the swirling darkness. The warmth between them spread outward, pushing against the freezing cold of the spirit's power. They focused on the warmth, on the love and strength that had kept them alive through everything. The storm had been born from the spirit's rage, but it was no longer invincible. With a unified cry, they stepped forward together, pushing through the storm's fury, forcing the light to grow brighter and brighter. The wind howled in rage, but it could not stop them. The snow fell away, the blizzard's grip weakening, the spirit's form shuddering as it began to unravel. "No, you cannot escape," the spirit screeched, but its voice faltered, cracking like ice breaking under pressure. The storm began to disintegrate, the darkness lifting as if it were being torn apart from the inside. The spirit screamed in anger and frustration as its power unraveled. But Claire and James pressed on, their connection stronger than ever. They were no longer the helpless victims of a vengeful ghost. They were survivors, and they would not be broken. With one final, powerful surge, the storm collapsed into nothingness. The winds faded, the snow vanished, and the icy cold that had threatened to consume them disappeared. They were left standing in a quiet, still world, a world that no longer held the storm's wrath. The dark figure of the spirit flickered and dissolved into the air, its presence finally vanishing. The house was gone, the storm was over, and Claire and James were free. They stood together, breathless, their bodies bruised but their spirits unbroken. The nightmare was finally over. The storm was no more. But as they looked around at the empty space where the storm had once raged, they couldn't help but wonder, what had they truly escaped?